It's my pleasure to opening the evening conversation between Peter Walgenbach and Woody Powell. And welcome to both of you. Welcome, Woody. Welcome, Peter. For some information advantage, I don't want to introduce you to Woody Powell. I only want to introduce Peter. And Peter is a professor of management for 20 years now, first in Erfurt and then Jena, Friedrich Schiller University of Jena, for organization, leadership, and HRM. And you both are familiar with each other, so we hope that we have an interesting, we are sure we have an interesting talk. So the floor is yours, and welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Wenzel, very much. I think we should immediately start with the interview. Professor Powell, I'm very, very pleased to have been given the opportunity to have this a conversation with you at this workshop. And I've prepared, as you know, several topics that I'd like to address in this conversation. But first, I'd like to introduce you, although I think this is not necessary because most of the attendees of this workshop know you and your work. But nevertheless, I'd like to do that. Professor Powell is Professor of Education, Professor of Communication, Professor of Sociology, Professor of Organizational Behavior, Professor of Management Science and Engineering, and Professor of Public Policy at Stanford University. Further, he is co-director of the Stanford Center of Philanthropy and Civil Society. Professor Powell has written many books and edited also many books and published a large number of articles in top-tier journals, many of which are cited very, very frequently. Okay, let's begin, Professor Powell. As I was preparing for this conversation, I went to my bookshelf and pulled out two books. This is the first one. Probably most of you know this book, the 1991 co-edited volume with Paul DiMaggio, The New Institutionalism in Organizational Analysis, or the so-called Orange Bible of New Institutionalism. And this book contains not only the foundational works of new institutionalism, but also many other articles that have significantly influenced the developments of new institutionalism over the last 30 years. Then I pulled out this book, more recent book with John Padgett, The Emergence of Organizations and Markets. And according to my assessment, it's especially these two books which have either co-edited or co-authored by you that have a specific relevance for our workshop here. Comparing the two books, I noticed that not only your theoretical approach to the social sciences and specifically to organizations, but also your research questions seem to have changed at least a little bit over time. Judging from my reading, the first book is mostly about isomorphism and organizational fields and about stability and persistence of institutions and organizations. The book with Padgett is about the emergence of new organizations and new markets. The first book is fundamental to institutional theory. The second book, from my reading, is based more on network ideas and emphasizes the role of chance in the emergence of markets and organizations. Well, there's a shift, at least from my point of view, in your work. And my first question is, could you please tell us how these shifts in your thinking and writing came about?
Okay, certainly. But first, thank you, Peter, for the work you put into this. And thank you, Wenzel, for the invite. I wish I was in Hamburg with you this evening to share a nice bottle of Riesling. That would be nice. But I'm sitting here in the morning in Palo Alto. So, you asked how thinking changes over time. We all evolve as scholars. For me, it was a frustration that most social science begins with the second act of a play. The characters have been introduced, their roles established, and the context explained. But there's no first act. As the economist Peyton Young put it, the dust has settled, but no one asks, where did the dust come from? So John and I thought that explaining novelty in organizations, or for that matter, novelty in anything, is one of the most difficult but more worthy undertakings that social scientists could pursue. We had the good fortune to be given a green light at the Santa Fe Institute to build a program on the coevolution of states and markets. It was one of their first, if not the first, social science program at the Institute. And so we thought we ought to take on a tough question. Understanding novelty seems especially worthwhile if you can combine it with empirical analysis. Most of our theories are really quite good at predicting or explaining stability and reproduction. That's what the Orange Book does, okay? In my earlier work with Paul DiMaggio. But, for John and me, the real mystery was, where does novelty and change come from? When and why do new organizational forms emerge? How do new institutional arrangements get created in the first place? This conference is about the corporate form. Where did the idea come from? In the US, it began, curiously, here in Santa Clara County with a lawsuit back in the late 1800s. And so trying to understand where institutions come from is, the task of the Green Book, if you want to call it that. I think both of the books are constructivist, but they're constructivist in very different ways. Both books tried to get people to rethink how they do social science. And a Green Book, John and I set out to reorient people to study, early stage processes of institutional genesis. When do new forms get created through the recombination and transformation of the relations between actors?
Thank you. You already mentioned constructivism, or at least pointed to it. But I want to come back to this point. In the introductory chapter of your book with Paget, you very critically reflect on the logic of methodological individualism and point out its limitations. And then you state in this book that you take something as a mantra for that book. In the short run, actors create relations. In the long run, relations create actors. I have two questions here. Why are you critical of the logic of methodological individualism? And would you please be so kind as to elaborate a little bit on the mantra for us?
Sure, I love doing this. But I ran into at a conference the other day where a philosopher I didn't know quoted that mantra, and that made me smile. I was really happy. So, it's not that we're so critical of methodological individualists. It's that, it cannot explain itself. That is, it cannot tell us where actors come from. So we set about trying to create a bottom-up constructivism, not focusing on fixed things with fixed attributes and fixed preferences, but on how things are changing. So we wanted to know how micro-level interactions generate a substrata that is independent of its micro-origins. We're interested in the social construction of persons, of categories of actors, or categories of thought, such as the corporate actor. We're not alone in trying to develop an alternative and corrective to the attribute or variable-centered approach that dominates U.S. social science. I think this work on micro foundations has parallels across a number of social science disciplines. To reach the German context, I've been working on this with Klaus Rehrup, who teaches at Frankfurt Business School. But look, in the short run, of course, we all meaningfully orient our behavior towards others. We have constraints, economic constraints, political, social constraints. So in a static analysis, we're all methodological individualists. But we are also, and we would say profoundly so, the product of past relations, both those that we've personally been involved in and other relations and systems of relations that that we and others are embedded in. So for us, biography, our biography, is the product of these affiliations. So we think of networks as like a zipper that pulls together who we are as persons. So in that sense, we're relational sociologists, hence the mantra. In the short run, actors create relations, but in the long run, relations create actors. Now, for organizations, a way of thinking about this is that people carry skills and networks with them as they flow through organizations. These skills and networks get modified through social interaction via learning and forgetting. In that sense, John and I are very Marchian. We borrow a great deal from Jim March. Organizations reproduce themselves by intersecting biographies that flow through them. Think of the way that Wenzel introduced you. He introduced you by the universities you've been at, and the affiliations that you've had at these different universities are a huge part of who you are as a person, but also they're a part of who the organization is. So for us, organizational autocatalysis and the social construction of people are dual.
So you already mentioned two terms, which I think are very important in the introduction, which you already referred also to. That is the multiple network that exists somehow. And I think it would be great if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And the other concept, which I also found very, very interesting, is the concept or the idea of autocatalysis, which I think is not familiar to most of us because it comes from chemistry. And could you elaborate also on this idea? Would be great.
I'll do it in a couple of ways, but let's start with multiple networks. And we have a very strong commitment to this idea of multiple networks because we think we're simply not the people that most social science theories suggest. People are bundles of different interests and identities, which change from different points in time and at different places. You, Peter, are a professor, you're a teacher, you're a son, you're a family member, you're a member of your community, to name probably only a handful of your many roles. While you may be consistent in any one of those roles, the demands and configurations of the different roles require different things of you. I always reminded of this in interactions with my son and my former graduate students. My son used to fuss at me when he was a teenager and say, "Dad, I'm not one of your graduate students. I don't need your advice." And I still remember one time a graduate student who was now an assistant professor was staying over. And my wife yelled upstairs, "Sweetie, would you like waffles or pancakes?" And my grad student yelled back, "Oh, waffles would be great." Well, she was speaking to my son, but what was happening was one accepted the role as family member, the other resisted the role as graduate student. So these roles we're in, are often in sharp conflict. John and I think roles have interests and roles have identities, but people are a bundle of these different identities and interests, and they toggle back and forth between them. So if we see people as mixtures of different roles and purposes at different times and places, we can analyze multiple networks and see how they fold, rewire, and disband over time. So in that sense, most social science assumes an interest-based or identity-based view of the world, and we most definitely do not. People are multifunctional concatenations of different roles. The social psychologist George Herbert Mead said it beautifully. He referred to humans as a parliament of selves and recognized that roles are often conflicting. And there are two moves that we take with this insight. For a German audience, I might emphasize that our work really is a network version of Max Weber, in the sense that we stress the transformative consequences of the intersection between spheres or domains of social life. Weber defined these spheres substantively. Here, for us, the domains are reflected in networks, but in both, an important source of organizational transformation is the collision between different spheres, collisions that lead to adaptation, to importation, to inclusion, homology, all of the kind of mechanisms that we describe in the book. If you prefer a visual image, you could think of people or organizations like Venn diagrams, and they're overlapping. And so our book goes to some length. You'll see in the book all of these figures that try to show the kind of connections between one. And we do one network and another. And we do that to show that when one network partially penetrates another, it can spread new ideas to it. And often more importantly, it can bring those new ideas and practices back to its own network. And that's precisely the idea of autocatalysis. So John and I, wanted to figure out how can we develop a theory of flow, out of which objects and behaviors emerge. There's no such thing as virgin birth. Everything, all novel things are a permutation on what previously existed. So we worked together at Santa Fe and we searched wildly and widely for ideas. There was no lead candidate that was there. We actually started in science and technology studies. We read Bruno Latour. We read Peter Gallison's remarkable book, Image and Logic. We looked at work on boundary objects. We read evolutionary game theory. We looked at the new Schumpeterian economics. There are a lot of people then at Santa Fe in the early part of this century who were developing some of the early work on computational social science and on power laws. So that received our attention. There's really fascinating work in developmental and evolutionary biology that we found super interesting, but we had a hard time importing into the social sciences. So what we were doing is looking for ideas that we thought would be fertile. We both had a mutual commitment to fine-grained historical data. I was studying the origins of Silicon Valley. John Padgett was studying the origins of the Renaissance in Florence. We were blown away by parallels. We found letters that were 550 years apart. They were almost verbatim in their content. And so, we wanted something that would help us understand biography and careers. And you might notice, in the book, we think of biography as a structure producing mapping. And the book is dedicated to Harrison White. And some of Harrison's best work drew on polymer chemistry, especially these ideas he had about wheeling and annealing. So work in chemistry had some appeal. And we spent a good bit of time with Walter Fontana. And he introduced us to Nobel Prize winning German chemistry on autocatalysis. In that sense, autocatalysis, though, was not chemistry, it was life. It was fundamentally social. It helps us with our theoretical ambition of trying to see how things operate at multiple levels of development. But you don't have to have a deep understanding of the biochemical roots of our argument to appreciate the basic model of production. The simple model is organizations are containers of skills. Skills are rules and routines. Skills change products into new products and services. Trade involves the movement of products through firms, which can change skills. And with that, you get the coevolution of products and organizations. So autocatalysis for us was deeply relational. It was self-reinforcing, self-reproducing, and it could be applied to persons, to organizations, to ideas, to resources. So that's why it had some appeal, more so than all these other wonderful ideas that we spent years reading.
Thank you very much for this explanation. And as I've already written to you, I really like these ideas of multiple networks and also autocatalysis. And I also believe that the mantra that you propose is a very good foundation for designing and conducting empirical organizational science studies. And that's something you've already demonstrated in the book with Paget, which I think is very interesting, and it's a recommend read that you have to have a look at. But even when I read the introductory chapter for the first time, I wondered whether this conception does not oversimplify, at least a little bit, when we want to understand the emergence of organizations as actors and markets as relationships. To be more specific, unless we want to assume complete randomness in the emergence of new relationships and new actors, I think there must be at least one other element that influences the probability of entry into a relationship. Oh, sorry for that. The probability of entry into a relationship, that is markets or organizations. And I see two possible elements which influence this probability. First would be, if you stay with the metaphor of biochemistry, something like an energetic charge seems to be important to establish a connection between elements. This energetic charge could in the social sciences, for example, be grounded in the presence or attraction of ideas and or resources. And the second possible element I see could be the combinatorial ability of someone like Gregor Mendel. I personally think it could be both energies, that is ideas or resources carried by actors, transferred into relationships and transformed into new actors, and or an ingenious social engineer who enables these transfers and transformations through his combinatorial skills. So my question here is it not, or are not ideas an important element in the emergence of new organizations and new relationships? Is it not ideas or resources that are brought into new actors, organizations? Is it not ideas that become the purpose of new actors, that is organizations, or the roles of new actors, for example, persons?
That's a good question. It's a tough question, and we could spend a long time on it. On one level, I think I disagree with you sharply, and so I'll push back on that. But on another level, we may not be that far apart. So the first thing I would say is I don't want to overstate what you're calling chance and randomness. I think what seems like chance and randomness is in fact some of this combinatorial skill. So let me give you an example. In the early days of the life sciences industry, in the development of biotech back in the 1970s, there wasn't a model that you could use of a prototype. You know, we had the early days of computers, and they would bring out successive generations of largely dysfunctional computers, but there was a prototype. But you can't have a prototype. Oh, and the prototype served as the basis for attracting financing. So you couldn't have a prototype of a new cancer drug. They had to go through a long period of testing. You know, obviously in our current moment of the pandemic, they've sped that process up. But still, the idea of a prototype didn't work. But some very creative scientist repurposed scientific papers and turned them into prototypes that attracted the attention of Wall Street. And so people on Wall Street started saying, wow, that's an article in Science, that's an article in Nature, that must be a hot firm. Now, was that visionary? Who knows? I don't think so. I think it was using a tool from one domain, an elite scientific paper, and repurposing it in another and altering the way in which Wall Street and venture capital thought about progress. So it was taking the tool of science and inserting it in finance. Now, of course, in the long run, what happened is financial considerations and market considerations flowed back into the universities, and universities started to get evaluated on, how entrepreneurial they were and, how good they were in science. So in that sense, I'm partial to your question. In another way, though, let me say I have difficulty thinking that ideas and resources exist independently. I want to know where, from people, I want to know where do the ideas come from? Who creates them? Where did that category of person come from? What created that category of thought? Where did that particular resource come from? I mentioned the letters, Florentine letters of credit and technology transfer letters from the 1980s. And they talked about, in the Florentine case, relations of neighborhood and the exchange of daughters. And in the Stanford licensing case, they talked about relations of science and the exchange of graduate students. Daughters and graduate students were, in a sense, fungible property that moved to cement relationships. So I want to know, not how these things float out of the air, but I want to know where they come from. I mentioned to you, a great paper by John Meyer and Brian Rowan on organizations as myth and ceremony. And I still remember very clearly when I was a grad student, I was laying on my living room couch during a snowstorm, being lazy, kind of thumbing through American Journal of Sociology, and I encountered this paper, and it blew my mind. But I also wanted to know, where did these myths come from? Why this myth and not another? So over time, John has developed a brilliant neo-Weberian argument about the rationalization of society and the scientization of society. But that process isn't inevitable. And we see in the world we live in today that is not even continuing or complete. Why do we suddenly see so much anti-science, a resurgence of populism, widespread racial, ethnic, religious prejudice? So I don't think ideas, and resources are just floating around. They are the product of the clash of networks.
Okay, so this was, I think, very helpful. And based on our conversation we had up front, I really understood what you mean by these relationships and the creation of actors through relations and the creation of relations by actors. And this is very interesting. But nevertheless, if I consider to be a PhD student, who has to write a doctoral dissertation, I would still ask myself, to what extent is it useful to abstract from ideas and resources if I want to write a dissertation? To express it in other terms, in terms of research pragmatics, what is the advantage of focusing primarily on relationships and actors?
Well, I think what I would tell students is you want to go where the action is. You want to study fresh things. You don't want to study old things unless you can think about them in a fresh new way. And so the building blocks I would tell them is to ask where things came from. All of us are probably thinking about what will the world of the academy look like in a year or two. And, I think we will carry lots of things from our current experience and insert that into the academy in ways that will be really quite different. So, I tell my students, emphasize, the last thing you should be studying is something that's well understood. Study something that's not understood. Okay.
So one last question, content-wise, to that book. A question that appeared when I read it is, how can the mantra be applied if the actor, for example, a firm, has already come into being? In other words, can you also use this mantra to analyze how an organization or a market changes after it has emerged?
Yeah.
Or do you think that earlier ideas that you developed, such as the concept of isomorphism, which is an important part of your earlier work, are more useful in this regard?
Well, I think what I try to do is hybridize the two, if you will. So I'm doing work now with Massimo Riccoboni at Venice on assembly, and we're asking ourselves, both with existing organizations and then also studying the formation of organizations, what building blocks can go with others, what pieces fit together. And so you want to see what elements combine, but you also, and this is the network side of us, we want to understand what elements repel. And so you can see what kinds of features go hand in hand with one another. This, a quick example might work. So earlier I mentioned these new companies, startup companies that use scientific papers as prototypes and, in a sense, gave away their ideas to the public by publishing them. Now, they did that as a way to raise money. They also did it as a way to attract human capital and to say you can publish. But they also did it in time to learn that they reduce the risk of people leaving the academy and moving to industry, because if you still could publish, that was a lifeline back. I remember reading an interview with a German executive at Schering-Plough, who was one of the early pharmaceutical people smart enough to get involved in the life sciences in the 1970s. And he said, I'm really fascinated by this work. These are some of the most brilliant people in the world. I think this is the future of biology and the pharmaceutical industry. But I just don't understand giving away your publications. That's, you're giving away your crown jewels. You can't do that. You have to hide them and protect them. So for him, this idea was absolutely heretical. For others, it was possibility. So what I want to know about existing organizations is which of these elements they put together, which ones fit poorly, and which ones fall apart. So.
Okay, thanks again. If it's okay, Professor Powell, I'd like to change the subject and to come to another topic. In the run-up of our conversation, we had a lively email exchange in which you pointed out that we have other problems at the moment than dealing with the iron cage, and I fully agree on that. For example, you mentioned rising racism, growing inequality, and the corona pandemic. And I think these are all major challenges that affect the world's nation states to varying degrees, but the pandemic affects all societies and more or less all sectors of Western societies, also the universities. So my question here is, what impact will the pandemic have on the university? How will it change universities? That is our research and teaching, but also the transfer of knowledge generated in universities to society.
Well, think of the huge changes we've experienced this past year, and one could think of those. I'm actually quoting from a review that oddly just appeared recently. Someone must have spent their time during the pandemic reading this huge tome, and the person said, during the past year, human civilization has experienced unprecedented change. After reading this book, one walks away with an understanding that the forces of network disruption we see today are taking civilization on a new and unforeseen path. So think about, what's happened over the past year in the academy. Many things haven't worked. We've lost in the US hundreds of thousands of students in high schools and universities, but some things have worked. Last quarter I taught 2 courses, graduate courses with students from Seoul, Singapore, Sao Paulo, Lima, Shanghai, the US East Coast, along with students who are on campus. We're having this conversation now. This would not have been the normal before. As we were talking before we began the conversation, you were saying you're spending lots of time with your students in a role that you might call psychotherapist, right? And we probably all are. what's it going to be like when you go back into the classroom with those same students, and now you know so much about them? You know where they live, you know what their living room and bedrooms look like. You know, the level of intimacy you've had over the past year is going to make the world different. I suspect it'll be much harder to be Herr Doctor Professor after having had this experience with the students. So I think in some ways the very nature of teaching is going to look different. And you might ask, how is a return to normal even possible? You know, the pandemic has exposed all the ways the old normal was riddled with fissures, and those fissures are now cracked. So putting them back together seems like the wrong thing. We're going to have to create new things. And I think, you know, one might imagine there'll be much more a sense of urgency about research, that research has to be related to tackling societal problems. And societies are going to ask universities, you know, what have you done in the past year? And so the expectations on us are going to be much higher in that regard.
Okay. Yeah, let's move
It's
to
sobering.
Yeah. Let's move to another, perhaps more important issue that is more closely related to the other problems that you mentioned in your email, or our email exchange. And in your current research, you are exploring the question of whether civil society organizations are part of the bulwark against autocracy, and whether they can prop up increasingly weakening states, that is, states which become weaker and weaker. Specifically, you are currently conducting a project in 7 cities around the world to explore this question. And my question is, would you please tell us a little bit about this project and its findings?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you where it began and then how it came together. You know, I'll be really honest. Back in November 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, I sat around with my graduate students, and we talked about our work, and we decided to change our research agenda. I couldn't see much sense in continuing to do what I was doing, as autocracy grew and spread in formerly democratic societies, and dictatorships were on the rise all over the world, and dictators are having an easy time of it. So I got the idea for this Civic Life of Cities project, and we're trying to understand whether civil society organizations, you know, offer any hope for democracy. And, you know, it's our view that around the world, civic organizations, you know, are integral to the social fabric. They address local priorities, they cultivate creative expression, they spur support for environmental activities and preservation, they provide sanctuary for the unhoused, you know, they treat the sick, they build recreational spaces. You know, in this sense, constructivist again, in that their work is not only embedded in daily life, it is constitutive of it. So we wanted to see, could we study the way in which the various threads of communities are tied together? So I assembled a group of people, researchers in different areas, our own team in San Francisco, a group in Seattle, a group actually at Berkeley who works in Shenzhen, China, some colleagues in Singapore, colleagues in Sydney, and Vienna is our one old world city. They're all people I knew well and had interacted with before, so there's a high level of trust. And so there's now like 28 of us in these 7 cities, where we've interviewed more than 1,600 executive directors of civil society organizations in these cities. We've done it in Shenzhen as tanks roll through the streets on the way to suppress protesters in Hong Kong, and nevertheless been able to do random surveys in Shenzhen. We're doing it in Singapore, even though it is a strongly autocratic society. And we're trying it in all kinds of different studies. But when we began, our focus was on economic inequality, refugee crisis, climate change, autocracy. But in 2020, COVID hit, and one of the things we noticed, well, two things we noticed. One, response to COVID has been dramatically different across countries or across our cities. Civil society organizations played a huge role in every case in responding to it, but they responded in very different ways. In Shenzhen, the civil society organizations became much more closely linked to government policy about the virus. In Taipei, Asia's leading democracy is Taiwan, but the civil society organizations became very tightly linked to government policies. And in the Bay Area, even knitting clubs became public health organizations. Immigrant service organizations became health, but there was no coordination. And so what you saw in response to COVID was this contrast, just a really profound contrast between security and autonomy. And in some places, civil society organizations played a huge role in ensuring security, ensuring safety. And in other places, they've been very valuable in providing services, but, everyone to their own thing. And one worry I have is that if you look at these diverse responses and you're a young person, you might ask, do I want safety and security, or do I want freedom and the dangers inherent within it? But we're trying to, understand what is the ability of civil society organizations to kind of serve and preserve the communities that depend on them. And it's been a really fascinating project. We've done the surveys in Mandarin, in German, in Aussie, in Singlish, and in English. And often when we present the results to people, we don't say what country, we translate them into English, and we don't say what country the response is from and ask people to guess. And there, Peter, you'll smile and be happy, because the level of global isomorphism is rather considerable. Many of the comments from Shenzhen, which is one of the tech capitals of the world, with Huawei and Tencent and others there, sound like they're from Silicon Valley. They're often interchangeable, except Shenzhen is much more technologically sophisticated than we are in the US.
Okay, talk about civil science organizations, civil society organizations. Do you think also about corporate foundations? Do they play a role in this context, or don't they? So that's, at least in Germany, we have some corporate foundations which engage in these activities, for example, supporting democratic institutions and so on. That's not all of them, but at least some do that.
Some do.
I think, for example, of the Abel Stiftung in Jena, which is a very important actor in Jena, a very local foundation, corporate foundation, and it's very active in this regard. Do corporate foundations play a role, or don't they?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting, and we could have a whole discussion on this. And actually, Helmut Anheier at the Hertie School in Berlin is one of the leading experts on this. In Germany, the Bosch Foundation played a huge role in Poland in the 1970s under Soviet rule, funding solidarity. So corporate foundations loom large in the German context, but in the US, corporate foundations play a very small, tiny role in the overall landscape of philanthropy. The major US philanthropies are largely extensions of people and families. Some of them are formed more than a century ago, like Ford and Rockefeller. Others are new and they have living donors. like Gates. And so with a living donor on hand, they're important, but they provide an enormous amount of the funding for civil society organizations. They have, in many cases, replaced the market and earned income as a source of funding. There is a brand new form, maybe worth thinking about for this conference, called the LLC, the Limited Liability Corporation. And you see Chan Zuckerberg, the Emerson Collective, that's Laureen Powell Jobs, Arnold Ventures converting from foundations to LLCs. So they're sort of a hybrid corporate form. And actually with a student, Aaron Horvath, we've been starting to study these. We have a project we call Seeing Like a Philanthropist, where we try to understand the vision and blind spots of philanthropic power and the ways in which we've moved from an era of the benevolence of business to now the business of benevolence. But I think the role of firms as opposed to the role of people in the foundation world differs dramatically across countries. In Austria and Germany, the personal foundations play very small role. But Siemens, Bosch, Volkswagen, they're quite important. By contrast, in the US, the corporate foundations are relatively unimportant. In China and Shenzhen, the corporations do a lot of CSR work and funding and provide platforms, particularly the tech companies, for nonprofits. But most of the funding in China comes from individuals. You get Jack Ma giving as an individual, not through his company.
Okay, in light of the observations of the current global developments you reported here and which you have expressed in various recent interviews, I would like to ask you, where do you see a need for research in the social sciences in general and in organizational sociology in particular? Where do we have to do research from your
big question, and we're late. I mean, it's late there for you guys, so I don't want to go on. But one thing, there are two things we hinted at in the Green Book that we haven't done enough follow up. And John and I have diverged a little bit, not personally, but just in our interest. He's focusing more on one, I'm on the other. He wants to understand cultural, linguistic, symbolic autocatalysis. He wants to explore how categories of thought, of art, of architecture, of literature, how they've evolved. And he'd like much more focus on the symbolic roles of organizations. I've become more interested in what I might call structural vulnerability, or something that I've in some papers I've called poisedness. When are social systems, when are organizations vulnerable to perturbation? And I must say, this was a question that I've been working on long before the chaos of our present moment, but it certainly seems like something to really focus on now. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So, a question to both of you, Woody and also Wenzel. Do we have still the time for one final question? This is a more personal one, not so much on academic research.
It's time for one question, of course, Peter.
Woody, is it okay for you too?
Sure. No. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Professor
How much does one get to opine like this? This is fun.
Woody, not only have you written significant and influential books and articles, but you're also very much involved in training the next generation of academics. I'm thinking not only of your role as former director of ScanScore, but also, not least, of the 2-week summer interdisciplinary reboot camp for junior scientists at the Center of Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences that you organize in collaboration with Bob Gibbons, an economist, and of the annual PhD workshop that you have organized and conducted for many, many years now at various locations in Europe. And these workshops have been attended, I think, by countless PhD students. And I personally had the opportunity to attend 2 of these workshops. Both times, I was really impressed by the motivation and commitment with which you and your team teach young academics. And this holds also true for my PhD students who participated in these workshops. So my question here is, what motivates you to work tirelessly for science?
Well, I could give lots of reasons. Gibbons and I say at the beginning of the Summer Institute, this is a setting where for 2 weeks, about 10 to 12 hours a day, we're going to work with 16 young faculty in economics, sociology, law, management, political science. And we say to them, they're the department we'll never have. We're stuck in our departments. We have to put up with people like ourselves. But, for the summer, Bob and I get to choose 16 junior colleagues. And it's just a treat. So the first thing is, I enjoy it. I guess I see it as a responsibility. In one sense, I'm just passing on what I was taught about. My advisors were Charles Perot and Louis Koser. A young Mark Granovetter was an assistant professor who's on my committee. They were immensely supportive of me and gracious with their time, but I also noticed in watching them, Koser in particular, here is this, elegant German immigrant, born in Berlin, lived in Paris. He would go travel to tiny US colleges in the middle of nowhere to give lectures. He'd come back sick or whatever, and he just said, they asked me I should go, and so I think that's part of, the sense that doing these things is, in part how you'll be remembered. So it's your own personal legacy. But I'll go back to being a methodological individualist for you to close, Peter. I meet future collaborators, now in Hamburg. Achim Oberg is a professor at the University of Hamburg. I met him first in one of these workshops, and we became a collaborator, and we wrote some wonderful papers together and did some great work together. If I hadn't done the workshop, I would have never met him. Christoph Brantner, who became a student of mine at Stanford and is now a professor at EM Lyon, assistant professor. I met him at the workshop, the institutional analysis workshop in Vienna, and said, you ought to, he wasn't thinking of applying to sociology. I actually think Stanford was the only sociology department he applied to. He was an urban studies guy, but I talked him into coming here. So there's the methodological individualism side. But in the long run, relations make actors. So, my best friends, closest friends, are my former students, and I'm counting on them taking care of me in my old age. So there you have it.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Powell, for the interview, for the conversation, and thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you, Peter. This was fun.